Hello, everybody. This is Bill McKibben from 350.org, and we are very, very happy, the three of us, to be joining you on day 2 of Earth Day Live. Today is Follow the Money Day, Finance Day, Divestment Day, Stop the Money Pipeline Day. Today, we're looking at how it is that the fossil fuel industry has managed to keep doing its thing, even in the face of about the other impacts of fossil fuels. Some of you, as many of you know, it's because our financial system, our insurance companies, our asset managers, and our banks keep throwing direction of the fossil fuel industry year after year after year. Just to give the most obvious example, Chase Bank, biggest bank in the world, has given $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Climate Accords. We didn't even need Donald Trump pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accords. Chase Bank has been doing their best to sabotage them from the start. But all of that sounds kind of abstract sometimes. So today, we're going to talk about what it looks like on the ground when Chase Bank hands over a big chunk of money, or any of these other financial institutions, to the people who want to build pipelines, to the people who want to frack, to the people who want to do all the other things that they're doing. A lot of us live in places where there aren't oil wells and pipelines. We live in cities and suburbs, and we're dealing with all kinds of our own traumas at the moment. But the ongoing trauma for years, decades, really in many ways centuries, has been out in these places where we mine resources and where we take land in order to get done what we think we want done. And we've got two people today who represent those fights at their feistiest, right in the middle of all that's going on. And so it's a real pleasure to have Joye Braun and to have Houska with us. And they can talk about what it's like trying to take on the Keystone XL pipeline, what it's like trying to take on Line 3. And they can talk a little bit for our brothers and sisters up north of the border who can't be with us today because they're trying to take on the Trans Mountain pipeline, and they're being just literally physically attacked right at the moment by the people who are trying to smooth the way for it. So these are hard stories to hear, but they're important stories to hear, and they help explain why it's so important for us to be cutting up credit cards, to be closing down operations where we can of these banks, to be doing even the things we can do during a pandemic, like taking over their social media and their websites. So Joye, maybe you go first and talk for a little bit about, you've been heavily involved in the Dakota Access and in the Keystone fights, and this Keystone fight's been going on. Well, I had more hair when it started, I know that. And so bring us up to date on where we are, and bring us up to date on what the role of these financial institutions has been.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see everybody. I'm glad you're all really engaged in Earth Day, in the first day of Earth Day, and now in the second day of Earth Day. It's really, really glad, positive energy. We're going to send out immense good vibes with this and keep the momentum going. Keystone XL fight really started with Keystone 1. And then when that was built, then they started, well, we're going to do another one. We're going to do Keystone XL. We're going to make it bigger, better. We're going to move more oil, move more bitumen, more tar sands through. And then they decided that they were going to, originally they planned to go right through my reservation here on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, which is in South Dakota, which is just the border. We share a border with Standing Rock. If you follow Dakota, we were the reservation right underneath Standing Rock. And a lot of Cheyenne River people went up there because that's our sister nation, right? But Keystone XL originally wanted to go through Cheyenne River, and we said, nah, that's not going to happen. We eventually turned trucks around, kicked TransCanada out of our reservation, and made it illegal for them to come onto our reservation, exercising our tribal sovereignty, doing that. Right now, the latest news is we had a win in the courts with Keystone XL. The Judge Morris in Montana did a judgment pulling the National Permit 12, which allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to have pipelines, transmission lines, cables go over waterways. So there's 3 major waterways with Keystone XL pipeline: the Missouri River, again fighting to save the Missouri River, and then the Yellowstone River, and then right here the Cheyenne River, which is the river at the southern border for my reservation. So that kind of put a stop to some of that. Doesn't mean that they can't stop building things though. Doesn't mean that they can't construct other places where the pipeline doesn't cross the river. Doesn't mean that they can't do pipe yards. Doesn't mean that they can't do these evil man camps. And Tara can talk about man camps too, because that's something that we have in common a lot along these pipelines, and something our brothers and sisters up north, Conahos and them, dealing with man camps as well. They bring just evil things, sex trafficking, human trafficking, drugs, alcohol. Just man camps are just a bad thing all around. So that's kind of where we're at right now with Keystone XL. We have to continue watching, we have to continue fighting, and we have to keep them off of our lands, and to just say, we're not going to let this go. I mean, we've already won Keystone XL 3 times before, right? We won 3 times before. Well, we're going to win again. You know, we're not going to stop until this is gone. And then we'll continue and take the lessons on to the rest of the world.
Amen to that. And many, many, many thanks for your leadership in this fight. Tara, you're many things, including a lawyer, and have some sense of how these things play out, not just on the ground, but back in the corridors of power where decisions get made in Wall Street. What's the kind of message? Tell us a little bit about where Line 3 is, and who's and what's. But what kind of message should we be trying to send back to into the corporate canyons there in New York? I just
wanted to say the way I introduce myself, I'm Tara Houska, Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation. Was born and raised just outside of International Falls, Minnesota. And I'm calling in from northern Minnesota. So we've been, I'm part of a camp collective that's been out on the just 200 yards off the proposed route for the last 2 years, camping and monitoring all activities of Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. It's another tar sands line. It's one of 3 that's proposed. So there's the Trans Mountain line, the Keystone XL line, and Line 3. Where we're at with Line 3 is, these guys, they always just keep coming back, right? Like that's kind of what we heard from Joye. That's what we've heard from you, Bill. And it's just, we call them zombie pipelines, right? Because they just keep coming back. So I would say that with Enbridge, with Line 3, first their plan was to do something called the Sandpiper Project. That was back before the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance really kind of reached the national narrative. And there was a lot of resistance to that, obviously. And then they were ordered to do this environmental impact statement, which is what we're always trying to seek in these cases. So they have some type of review that they have to go through, and we can, present our case in the legal system. And they ultimately they got ordered to do an EIS, and they were like, we're not doing that. Put all their money towards Dakota Access Pipeline. So Enbridge is actually almost the 3rd owner of the Dakota Access Pipeline. In my perspective, having spent many months out on Frontlines in North Dakota, Enbridge is responsible for the human rights violations and the abuses that happen there. They're responsible for the destruction of territory, for the destruction of human beings, and the trauma that was inflicted on people, because it's not just you know, the exciting parts of mace and tear gas and bullets and all these things that seem really gripping, there's real trauma and real hurt that comes with that, right? In addition to the things that Joy was talking about when it comes to man camps that have to build these lines, when it comes to existing poverty and existing substance abuse and existing, you know, systemic issues that exist in Indigenous communities. So that was their plan when they did that, and then they moved over to this Line 3 project, which was happening when Dakota Access. They do these things in tandem, right? Where we're at in the process is we have a Democratic governor, Governor Tim Walz, and it doesn't seem like whether they're a Democrat or they're a Republican that they are anti-fossil fuels. In fact, I would say that when it comes to that particular issue, they are birds that have they're just two wings on the same bird, right? So we are nearing the last permitting process, like the last stages of permitting Line 3 fully. We've already done our environmental impact statement. We've, in the state of Minnesota, they've issued the certificate of need and the route approval. Enbridge actually proposes to build a brand new corridor through our wetlands, through the headwaters of the Mississippi River, to the shore of Lake Superior, so right into the Great Lakes. We're at the last stages of that. So the state permits for water crossings and for bulldozing through wetlands. They plan to have Line 3 online by the end of 2020. That is what they've stated to their shareholders. That is what they have, you know, said over and over again in recent months. But I would add that, you know, this project was actually supposed to be online back in 2019, and then it was supposed to be online first at the beginning and then at the end, and like because of all this resistance, I mean, we're talking over $1 trillion, you know, or over $1 billion in delays and costs, right? That our resistance has cost them. I'd say for messages that we send back, you know, I may be a lawyer, but I'm oftentimes one of the voices in the room that's the least trusting of the governance systems. I would say I have a very pragmatic perspective on the limitations of a system that is so heavily skewed towards an industry and towards corporate actors that pay to have their day heard, right? They pay to have their regulatory process, and they pay to have their influence and to roll back regulations. I mean, we're seeing that in the Trump administration, but it's happened under the Obama administration. It happens no matter who that is really in charge. So, you know, the message here in Minnesota, they sent 68, we organized, and 350 was a big part of that, the local chapter, 68,000 comments against the pipeline project. 94% of public comments were against it, and they got a unanimous approval for the project. So I feel like the message that we send is, one, yes, take your money out of the banks. That is something you can do. That is something you can do right now. It is something that you can do tomorrow. It's something that you can organize people to do. That is powerful. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Chase, is under an immense amount of pressure and feels that. He hears that because it is just people at the end of the day. But I would also say that, you know, I don't know that necessarily our message is just for them. I think our message is to each other and what we can do when we empower each other. Like, our organizing power is so deeply heard by so many of these industries. They spend millions and millions of dollars to oppose people like Joy, to oppose people like me, to oppose people like you, Bill. I mean, that's power, collective power, and solution making.
Let me ask you both. I mean, we're all here online today doing our work digitally because we can't do otherwise. I mean, we'd planned to be occupying thousands of Chase Bank branches around North America today, and it would have been one, but we're not, because obviously we're not going to go run the risk of introducing germs into overcrowded jails where people have no way of social distancing and whatever. We take that kind of solidarity seriously. But the oil industry, in the middle of a pandemic, is using that pandemic as a cover to go out and try and start building infrastructure in places with, you know, underserved healthcare systems. Rural America is not very good, robust healthcare systems. And in particular, they're doing it on the edge of Indian country, in places where, you know, over the last 500 years, uh, uh, you know, bands have lost 90% of their population to introduced pandemic. I saw Faith Spotted Eagle last week just saying it feels a lot like smallpox blankets, you know, coming in. Um, talk about that a little bit. What kind of insult it feels to have, you know, big banks and big companies willing to do this at this point in the 21st century. And then talk about, if you would, the other epidemic here of missing and murdered Indigenous women and how all this connects. I mean, we've got two huge public health crises that it seems to me are getting made much, much worse by what's going on right now.
Well, just last week, elders from the Fort Peck Assiniboine Sioux Reservation in Montana, and along with some Blackfeet and some Northern Cheyenne relatives, headed up to the U.S.-Canadian border, where Keystone XL is right now building that border crossing. They got special permission to do that from the United States government, because remember, the Canadian-U.S. border is closed. But somehow this pipeline can be building in the middle of this coronavirus epidemic, this worldwide pandemic that's going on. And there isn't anything up there as far as healthcare is concerned. You have from the border to the nearest hospital, which is this little tiny hospital, it's 2.5 hours. So you have these men being housed in Glendive, Montana, in hotels right now, because there's 100 of them, and then they're going up to the border. In the meantime, which is really close to the Fort Peck reservation. In the meantime, surveyors and stuff are out there here by Cheyenne River near us. They're out by the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. They're out by Yankton, where my Tui Faith is at. They're out by Ponca, out in Nebraska. And so all along the route, everywhere they're concerned, everywhere there's a native reservation, these surveyors and these people are out there. And they are not following CDC guidelines. You might see one or two wearing a mask, and we got pictures to prove this. We got pictures to prove that they're not following CDC guidelines. And I even leaked those pictures to the Associated Press. And not one story came out of that. And why? Because of money. Who owns that? Who owns these news corporations? Who owns the ability to get that information out? Only independent people, only organizations like your organizations, my organizations, Tara, only us people can get that information out. And that's one thing we learned from Dakota Access Pipeline, is it has to be independent people getting that information out through the Moccasin Telegraph. You also asked about missing and murdered Indigenous women. I went up to Fort Peck one time because I was asked to go help search for a girl. We were lucky enough, we found her, and we were able to get her home. But while I was there, I learned of other women that weren't even reported missing or murdered because of the jurisdictional issues on that particular reservation. On Standing Rock, there's something like 38 or 40 missing women. On my reservation, there's something like 20 or more missing women. We don't even know the exact count, because even if we report it, it doesn't mean that it gets into any kind of national base. It doesn't mean it gets reported nationally. It doesn't mean that they're labeled as Indigenous or First Nations or the Lakota or Cheyenne or Anishinaabe. It doesn't get labeled that way. And so we don't even know the exact amount. We guess that there's about 6,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women here in the United States. 6,000 in a population that's estimated to be about 2.4 million. That's a lot of people. So, you know, talk about, and here on Cheyenne River, if you look all around South Dakota, There's little pockets of coronavirus popping up, but the two counties that are Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, there's nothing here. And why is that? Because we put up border checkpoints. We had to be proactive in how we were going to save our own people. And I honestly believe that through our tribal sovereignty, at some point in time, that somebody's going to go back and say, hey, how come this area right here didn't get hit so hard? Well, we had to be proactive because we got a lot of diabetes and heart patients and cancer, immunosuppressed people here. And that's true across Indian country. But right here, we were very lucky that our tribal chairman, Chairman Fraser, took it and deputized people, and we do turn people away.
Taro, what do you have a little bit to add there? Thank you, Joy, for that so much, and good news that you've got the roadblocks up.
You know, I would echo everything that Joy says for sure. I mean, that's a perspective and a reality that Native people across the country and also just across Turtle Island and across the world deal with. You know, this kind of disparate access to justice, disparate access to healthcare, you know, just a total disregard and dismissal in the national narrative. And that's been our reality since the beginning of colonization. You know, I would say with regard to COVID-19, you know, there'll be a program that comes out later today kind of giving an overview of all these different Frontlines fights. But as part of that, you know, we're including, just so people can actually see and understand, this is happening in real places to real people in real time. So here in, you know, what's now Minnesota, or so-called Minnesota, you know, we've got a bunch of people that are out. We've already got all the pipe yards and all that, similar to Keystone XL. They drop their pipes off years before they actually get approval for these projects, to try to force people into believing this is going to happen. You have no say, that you have no choice. But here we've got, you know, pre-construction is happening. People are bringing in tons and tons of all these matting to build work sites, tons of workers and trucks and constantly ongoing activity while we're allegedly in this huge pandemic. But in Minnesota, which is a Democratic state, in addition to all the other states along the way, so North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, we're talking about British Columbia, there's stay-at-home orders, but there's exceptions. Well, there's not stay-at-home order in North and South Dakota. They're a little, we're not going to go down that road, but there's a whole thing going on there. But in places where there are these stay-at-home orders to, you know, shelter in place, there are exceptions specifically for critical infrastructure. So specifically letting workers like pipeliners, like miners, like all these industries continue to go out, continue to do their work under the cover of this pandemic. You know, I think it's a twofold kind of situation, right? Because right now in Minnesota, we're looking at like local unions and things like that are preparing all this, but they've also got this plan where they're looking at 4,000 to 6,000 workers that will have to actually physically come into the state of Minnesota to build line 3. You know, that's their plan. And they're looking at, well, what do we do health-wise? You know, we said we're not going to build man camps in Minnesota, but we have to have temporary shelters, which is the exact same, you know what I mean? That's just another language for the exact same thing. You're talking about rural areas that have very little infrastructure supporting this massive influx of people. You know, how does that sit in the same line as public health, right? Like, we're supposed to be talking about what is public health. And we already talk about how these pipelines, we're really talking not just about the direct impacts to our communities and the direct impacts to people downstream if there's a spill, if there's a break, you know, this irrevocable harm that happens to wetlands, to watersheds, to our wild rice beds when we're talking about Anishinaabe people, to Sama when you're talking about, you know, British Columbia and Trans Mountain up north, to the Ogallala Aquifer when you're talking about our neighbors next door. There's all these irrevocable harms that happen anyway, but then there's like climate crisis, right? Which is happening. It's happening in real time all over the globe. And so you got that public health concern, but I guess we're not so concerned about the pandemic that's on the news every single day, every hour, with a death ticker on the side of our news when it comes to building a fossil fuel pipeline, when it comes to, you know, keeping the oil fields going, when it comes to keeping the tar sands mine going. You know, that should tell us what the priority is. And to the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue, you know, I mean, there's a bunch of horrific statistics that people can look up and learn more about that. I would just say that it is a grossly disturbing failure of equality and justice to know that in this country, in the United States, that we aren't even tracked. Like
Yeah.
that, you know, our population is so out of sight, out of mind that we don't even track that data. Like they've started to work on a reconciliation process in Canada, which is, you know, there's a whole commission on it, right? But or there's a national inquiry that's been in progress, but we don't even track it in this country. That's where we're at. So, you know, adding on to all the jurisdictional issues when it comes to courts and access to justice, whether you're on tribal land, federal trust land, reservation land, treaty land, state land, you know, all these questions, like that actually means real things to real people, has real impacts to real people, which means if you experience violence or sexual assault or, you know, any of these horrible crimes that do increase when thousands of people come into an area, thousands of temporary workers, that oftentimes we actually cannot prosecute those people, that we cannot seek justice, and that it's left up to the federal government, which declines these cases all the time. I mean, the actual prosecution rate for rape generally in this country is really, really bad. But when it comes to Indian country, it's even worse. And
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah. Guys, we are up against the next people who are coming on as part of this great extravaganza today. I think the points you've made are so powerful. And the thing that makes it super is the idea that somehow you would call these jobs and these workers essential or critical workers because they're building an oil pipeline at precisely the same moment that our government is going out of its way to try and figure out how to keep people from producing more oil because we don't even have a place to store it and there's no demand for it, is almost unbelievable. The collision of ironies and tragedies is stronger than ever on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And it's all rooted in the unbelievable greed of a small number of people, many of them in our financial institutions. I just want to thank the two of you for being out front all the time in this fight. We can't for the moment be physically shoulder to shoulder standing people down, but those days will come back. And when they do, it'll be a great pleasure to be back out with you guys. And in the meantime, let's do what we can to send a message to Wall Street, enough of this stuff.
Thank you so much. And we can be 6 feet apart, right? So there's still that.
Yeah,
we have to take these risks.
We can hold a rope 6 feet. We can still do it.
There's many things
That's
that
good.
we need to do and we have to do, right? We have to stand with the land in a real way. So thank you so much.
Amen. All right. Thank you guys so much. Brittany, thank you for your help here.